homelessness for people with serious mental illness in New York City. As you all know, New York City is experiencing a crisis of people with serious mental illness cycling between the city's subways, streets, hospitals, and jails, and back again. A crisis which has been amplified in recent days and weeks by a series of high-profile, random, tragic, violent incidents. So I want to take a moment this morning to remember Caleb Rios, a 14-year-old boy who was killed in the Bronx on Friday in a senseless stabbing, and Debrina Kawam, who was herself homeless, cruelly burned to death on an F train in Coney Island over Christmas. They join a too long list. People like Michelle Go, who was pushed on the subway tracks almost exactly 3 years ago today at the 34th Street station, just a couple of stops north of here. And some like Jordan Neely, who died just 2 stations away at Bleecker Street, begging to be locked back up at Rikers because that was the one place he had been able to find shelter and food and some modest amount of mental health care. Each of these incidents and too many more reflect a failure of our system, which leaves too many people falling through the cracks over and over and over again. It's a crisis for every one of them, and it's a crisis for New York City, leaving New Yorkers afraid to ride the subway. To address the crisis, Safer for All analyzes the failures, the huge gaps in what City Hall has been doing to date, and then it lays out a comprehensive plan to solve the crisis. First, the report looks at the failures in the current system, building on a series of audits and investigations that my office has conducted in recent years, which show that despite spending billions of dollars on outreach, on jails, on police overtime, on shelters, on homeless sweeps, on emergency hospitalizations, despite all of that, the Adams administration has failed to effectively coordinate a continuum of care that will get people the care they need and get them into stable housing and services. This keeps people with serious mental illness cycling from subway to street to hospital to jail and back again. Our audit of the administration's homeless sweeps in 2023 found that they overwhelmingly failed to connect people to stable housing. Out of 2,308 people that were forcibly removed, only 3 were connected to stable housing. The vast majority wound up on the street again that very night. And our audit of the city's intensive mobile treatment program, which is the program supposedly designed to provide service to exactly the set of people that we're talking about, is failing because the city isn't enabling providers to even keep track of their clients. So when Department of Correction releases someone from Rikers, they don't inform the care team, and the person just winds up back on the street again. In fact, we found in that program, they stopped tracking recidivism because the Department of Correction would not give the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene the information necessary to see whether people wind up back in jail again. Care teams lose track of people who need help on the streets. Hospitals release patients back to the street when inpatient beds are full or aren't even able to take them at all in the first place. Meanwhile, judges can't refer people to alternatives to incarceration or treatment programs because they don't have a sufficient number of slots. And both hospitals and jails discharge people with serious mental illness who they've found eligible for supportive housing, but without placing them in supportive housing the majority of the time. And so often they wind up right back on the street, and the cycle continues. These uncoordinated, disconnected programs cannot continue as they are. So Safer for All lays out a detailed plan to improve City Hall management and coordination of city agencies with a detailed focus on outcomes. Now, the single biggest reason we're at this crisis point is because for too long, City Hall has taken a housing last approach to the crisis. Homeless sweeps move people around, but don't attach them to stable housing. Hospitals and jails identify that people are eligible for supportive housing but release them back onto the street anyway, and no one gets better on the street. So, in place of the housing last approach that the Adams administration has been taking and failing with, we will adopt a housing first approach, which has proven successful in cities around the country, in Houston, in Denver, in Philadelphia, and even in New York City 15 years ago. New York City used a housing first approach to effectively end veterans' homelessness. Housing first has been proven to work 70 to 90% of the time to connect people with stable housing and services and have them stay stably housed. Housing First combines existing supportive housing, SRO units, vouchers, and service dollars that New York City is already spending to get people directly off the street into stable housing with the wraparound mental health and social services that they need. A big part of why a Housing First approach works is that people who are homeless and who are reluctant to go into the shelter system are far more likely to accept a room of their own. And once in that room, they're far more likely to get and accept the mental health services, the drug treatment, the social services, the therapy that enables them to remain stably housed, to keep themselves and others safe, and to succeed as they move on in their lives. It is so much more effective to have people receive those services in a room, in an apartment, in an SRO, than it is on the street, where it's difficult to see clinicians, where it's difficult to stay on your medication. Now, while Housing First has been proven to work 70 to 90% of the time, that means it does not work all the time. So our plan also proposes to expand and improve involuntary and court-ordered treatment and secure detention programs, which are necessary in some of those other 10 to 30% of cases. That includes increased flexibility for involuntary hospitalization, which will require legislation in Albany, which I hope will happen this session. It means building more secure therapeutic beds, sometimes called outposted beds, which the Adams administration has failed to bring online. They were left a plan for 360 outposted therapeutic beds. Not one of them has come online so far. We need those 360, and we need about 1,500 more. The plan lays that out. And it means enabling mental health court judges and AOT providers to connect people to supportive housing so that their sanctions and their treatment programs will work. Finally, for all of that to work, for the coordinated continuum of care, for the Housing First models, and for the mandated and secure treatment, both the city and the state must increase capacity in the mental health system, including in more supportive housing for the long term. State funding, unfortunately, was significantly cut during the Andrew Cuomo administration when Medicaid funding was reduced, and that is a big part of why our mental health systems have been eviscerated. The state is providing much less for city shelters as well than it was in previous years. We need those resources restored. The city and the state can invest together in both the voluntary, the housing, and the secure detention that is necessary to solve this crisis. Now, you might be thinking that this is all a pipe dream, that there's no way New York could do it, but it's not. Our research shows that there are only a total of about 2,000 people with serious mental illness, either sleeping unsheltered on the streets or subways, or at Rikers or in hospitals, who are likely, when discharged, to wind up back on the street. And you can look at those numbers in the report. We do a deep dive on this population, about 2,000 people. Meanwhile, there are over 2,500 vacant units of supportive housing in New York City right now. Many of those are SRO units, single room occupancy, which are a perfect unit to use for Housing First. There is more vacant supportive housing than there are people with serious mental illness sleeping unsheltered in New York City. We can achieve this goal. In this city of 8 million people, already spending so much on this set of services, with so much capacity and talent and such big aspirations, we can end street homelessness for people with serious mental illness on the streets of New York City. And we can make it a city where everyone can walk through their neighborhoods and commute on the subway in safety. That will be a New York City that is genuinely safer for all. Thank you very much for being here, and I'm happy to take your questions. And you're gonna have to speak up so I can hear you. I'm afraid I got the mic, but yeah. So no, supportive housing is stable, permanent housing. An SRO unit, generally you have a lease for. There are some SROs where you're in a program and don't have a lease. But generally supportive housing is a housing unit, might be small, might be a single room occupancy, but the tenant has a lease and services are provided. And that can be in a building that provides supportive housing overall, or it can be through vouchers as well. Shelters obviously are an essential part of New York City's system, and for those people who are homeless, who are on the subway and who get an outreach worker and will go that night into shelter, whether that's a traditional shelter, a safe haven, or a stabilization bed, that is a good model to help people get out of homelessness, get a roof over their head, and start to get on a path to care. But what we know is that the set of folks we're talking about here who have persistent severe mental illness, some of whom are also engaged in substance abuse, many of them are reluctant to go into shelter. And that's why even if you do a homeless sweep that you say is trying to provide people with connections to care, many people just move away and go somewhere else. And what Housing First does is says to those folks, not we're gonna give you a shelter bed, but we're gonna set you up with an apartment. We're going to give you a room of your own. And that's what dramatically increases both the likelihood that people will accept it and the success in the programs. As I say, Housing First has been shown to get both people to accept it and then to stay stably housed about 70 to 90% of the time, compared with 30 to 50% for treatment first, or sometimes called the housing ready programs. So there, obviously, is an important role for shelters, for safe havens, for stabilization beds, but the core model here, what Houston and Denver and other cities have done to genuinely end the crisis of street homelessness for people with serious mental illness, and what we can do here is use this housing first approach with a focus on supportive housing. Sure, of course. Absolutely. So we do propose expanding flexibility for involuntary commitment in several ways. So right now, a nurse practitioner can't be one of the two people that assign someone to and keep someone in hospitalization involuntarily. This legislation in Albany, sponsored by State Senator Brad Hoylman-Siegel and Michael Lasher, to change that. We propose in here also making sure that clinicians are required to look at a patient's entire history, not just their recent history. So there is in here some detailed recommendations for expanding flexibility for involuntary hospitalization, which is one element which we believe is necessary. But the challenge of that is at the end of that period, even if you get someone to accept hospitalization, you then have to have stable housing for them to go to, or they'll wind up back on the street. In the case of Jordan Neely, he was in a shelter, but he had not yet been connected to stable housing. We don't know what would have happened if he had been, but there's good evidence that in many cases that would work. So you need involuntary hospitalization, and sometimes, look, you need secure detention. That's why the mayor's failure to build those 360 secure detention outpost facilities, which are Department of Correction custody, but at hospitals for people who need psychiatric and other kinds of care, is so essential. To your first point, I apologize, remind me. Oh, yeah. So look, obviously it is critical. Obviously, it is critical to address violence in the shelters. The value of a housing first model, especially for the population that we're talking about, is that it skips the shelters and moves them directly into a room of their own, into an SRO or stable supportive housing with services wrapped around them. So you don't, with this set of people, have to, this is a way of addressing those fears. You're saying to someone, I'm not offering you a spot in shelter. I've got a room waiting for you, a room of your own. You can sign a lease. We will continue to provide care. It can be the same IMT care team that's already been building that relationship with us on the street, even as they start to move into that supportive housing unit. So it absolutely is also critical for the people living in the shelter system and to keep it a place that New Yorkers know that they can go safely to address safety in the shelter system. But what we believe for this approximately 2,000 people that are at the heart of the crisis of people who are homeless and mentally ill, the housing first model is the way to do it. Well, obviously during this last 2 years, the shelter population has grown dramatically, and we have spent money on providers for the range of rent and transportation and food. But there's a lot of good reasons to ask this question. When we audited the DocGo contract, $432 million no-bid emergency contract the Adams administration gave to a mental health staffing company with no history of operating shelters, and they submitted invoices, we found that literally 67% of the invoices were not documented. So these are questions we have dug in on as well. But in all these cases, we're not really paying for or looking at the outcomes, right? The outcome we want is not that someone got a night of shelter or that food was provided. The outcome we want is that they're attached to stable housing. They are stable with the services that they need. They're not in, the recidivism comes down, exactly what we're not able to track in IMT. That really gets to the first recommendation, which is better management from City Hall with attention to outcomes and real transparent reporting. That's a critical element of this plan as well. Yeah. Yeah, so, we discuss in the report the reinterpretation that the State Office of Mental Health did. They issued a memo looking at the current standard and finding much more flexibility in saying if someone is not able to take care of themselves or recognize that they're in crisis, that they can be involuntarily. What we believe is that there is additional flexibility needed for who can identify that someone needs involuntary hospitalization, giving that to nurse practitioners as well as doctors, that you need to look at the totality of might not know just from how they appear right now. But that's the flexibility that we believe is additionally needed. We think that State Office of Mental Health memo identifying the flexibility that providers need to see that someone who isn't able to take care of themselves and is in repeat crisis meets the standard for involuntary hospitalization. Yeah, this is a great question because Housing First is a model for housing with services. The theory is not that housing on its own solves the problem. It's that without housing, you can't get the problem solved. So IMT is a great example. IMT, you have a care team. It's about $55,000 a year. And it's social workers, clinicians, and doctors. And they make sure there's the idea is that they'll make sure you're taking your medication, that you're seeing a clinician and getting therapy. But if you're on the street homeless, it's very difficult to take your medication, see a clinician, or get therapy. So the proposal here is basically to take the service dollars we're already spending through IMT and in supportive housing and wrap them around people as they move into those units. And there'll be a handoff because you've got an outreach or an IMT provider. Then there's contracts as part of supportive housing to provide those services to people who are living in that building. So you need to make sure that handoff takes place, and in some cases there can be a step down of services as people, move toward independence, and then a steady level of services that's lower than what they needed when they were in crisis. but really, we're already paying for that for about 1,000 of these folks through IMT. And those SRO units and supportive housing developments that I mentioned come with city service contracts. So even the vacant units are already under contract. Obviously, once someone's in there, then you trigger that and provide the services. So this is a very important point. What works in Housing First is the housing unit plus the services.
But what about those other 1,000? So you said IMT would cover 1,000.
So some of them are getting, there's several other programs. There's a state program called ACT that some of those folks are in, but also service dollars come with the supportive housing contract that the providers themselves have. The supportive housing providers are the organizations that are providing housing plus services, and the city in most cases, sometimes with state funding, already has a contract with them for those units. So those dollars aren't triggered until a person moves in, but they're budgeted for already. Good.
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of piggybacking there to that end, do you think this wraparound housing first thing needs new dedicated revenue, or this is a pest control, or
Yeah.
sort of allocation?
Yeah, so both. I mean, as I say, we're already spending billions of dollars here. In terms of new money that we believe is needed, this plan is $100 million in its first year. That is for some resources to rehab some of those SRO units, which have been offline for a while and need some, resources to be brought up back online. There are some critical technology investments. I actually went out with a scout team on last Monday, a week ago today, one of the MTA outreach teams. And you've got these amazing nurses going out with MTA police officers. Thank you guys for being here. And they're talking to people and taking notes on their phone, but we found there's 3 separate systems. And so what the outreach teams are using, what the city's using, aren't connected. So there's some critical technology connections to get made if you're going to make those handoffs happen effectively. And then a few other startup and coordination costs. So $100 in the first year, about $30 million in additional costs, continuing every year after that. But over time, we'll save money because jail is very expensive, hospitalization is very expensive, and when the program works, as it has other places, to keep people stably housed 70 to 90% of the time, for all of those folks, you will wind up saving a significant amount of money over time. But we don't project those savings. We take the baseline of what we're already spending, add the $100 million one time and $30 million after that. I think it's a great idea. They are not in here, but I do support them. The city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development has done a pilot program on shared housing that I was an enthusiast when I was in the council of, and I actually worked on developing and would love as mayor to implement a set of zoning changes that would make that model possible, not just for this. We could use more shared housing across the market. It makes SRO units easier to build, but you also have situations where college students might like to live in an apartment with 5 or 6 people sharing one kitchen and a couple of bathrooms. So I think it is a good idea. It is not covered in this report. We do have other recommendations from dialogues with supportive housing providers about what we can do to build a new set of long-term supportive housing units, which will be critical for the long-term maintenance of the plan.
Any other questions on topic?
That's the additional cost. The supportive housing services are covered already through either IMT and ACT on the outreach side or contracts that the city has with the supportive housing providers on the other. We don't total all of that up because those are resources that are already in either the city or the state budget.
Any other questions going once, going twice? Any off topic?
So I looked back 4 years ago and I saw that another Andrew at this point in the news cycle was on top of the polls. If you'll go back and look at About Today 4 years ago, you'll see that Andrew Yang was on top of the polling. And even without Andrew Cuomo's high negatives, Andrew Yang did not prevail ultimately. This is the very beginning of the mayoral race. And I don't believe that New Yorkers want another corrupt chaos agent at City Hall. Andrew Cuomo resigned in disgrace, facing charges of sexual harassment. He lied to Congress and to New Yorkers about sending seniors with COVID into nursing homes. And actually on today's issue as well, if you look in the report, you'll see it was in the Cuomo administration that substantial cuts to Medicaid eviscerated our mental health system. And he also starved the subways of resources that they needed. Honestly, if we had not made those cuts to the subway, maybe we'd have the platform barriers and station gates that we now have to pay for with resources through congestion pricing.